Okay, I have a game here where I have rows and columns of coins, and the idea is to, as the player, to shoot these coins. So the player moves along the bottom of the screen and shoots the coins, and eventually it will be programmed so that each coin will be linked to some kind of point system. But for now, what I'd like to talk about is the way the rows of coins have been programmed to spawn randomly, because as you can see, there's different characters here, different I guess you would call them personages on these coins, and they are appearing from the top of the screen randomly. Now, this particular person, Elagabalus, that's the emperor's name, this particular person is appearing more than any of the others at this point because he's a placeholder. So right now there's a total of 14 possible coins, different types of coins with different people on them that could spawn, but I only have it set up at this point for I think about 6 of them. So the rest of them are just being filled in with this particular emperor here. So the way this is set up is that every time the player shoots an entire row, horizontal row of coins, all the coins will drop down one row, and then a new row will spawn and come down from the top. Now, I'll go ahead and shoot the last coin in this bottom row, and you'll see that that will happen. So all the coins drop down, new row of coins spawns from the top. So I'll demonstrate it one more time. See how that works. Now, the goal for me was to figure out a way to get the coins to drop down and spawn when only an entire row was destroyed. So you could see that if I shoot up a column, nothing happens. So there's 4 coins in the column, there's 4 coins in the row, so it's only when a horizontal row of 4 coins total is destroyed that the coins drop down and the spawning occurs. So it's quite a bit of programming to get this to work properly. Let me show you the game as it looks in Unity. What I have here is in Unity, in the preview window, I have what I'm calling gates, which are just objects, 3-dimensional objects with colliders attached to them, set up as kind of a floor or a gate that the coins are not able to fall through. And I have the mesh renderer turned off in the normal gameplay, but just for this explanation, I've got the mesh renderer on so that you could see them. And in this view, you could see that they are. This is a game that's done in 2D using sprites, but the colliders themselves, the gates themselves with colliders, are 3D objects placed in this 3D space, or in the 2D space. So you can see how they're placed. This is all set up with layers, so the fact that the gates appear to be far forward from the actual coin images really doesn't matter. In 2D mode, Unity is ignoring that fact. It's just so that the user can visually understand or visually organize the space, that we can see this in 3D. If I go ahead and play the game in preview mode with these gates turned on, I'll go ahead and, I know it's a little bit small, but I want to be able to show both the preview gameplay, the two-dimensional gameplay, and also just how what's going on in Unity itself. So I'll go ahead and shoot up a row here. So in order for the coins to drop down, it's programmed so that when an entire row is destroyed, the 3 colliders or gates above the bottom one are being deactivated briefly, just long enough for the coins to fall through, and then being reactivated again so that it stops the coins. And the bottom one is never deactivated. It's always on, because the coins are not going farther down than this bottom row. They're not moving all the way down. So I'll show it once again. Okay, you should be able to see here I've got these game objects. They're empty game objects called, I'm calling them gate coin. If I do this again, 3 of them should deactivate temporarily, long enough for the coins to drop down, and you can see they grayed out, so they temporarily deactivated. Okay, so the way this is set up, the way that the game objects are set up in the hierarchy is that there are empty game objects which organize for each row. There are 4 rows total in this game field, 1, 2, 3, 4. These are horizontal rows versus vertical columns. There are 4 empty game objects, 1 for each row, and within each row there are 4 spawners, 1 for each position in the row. So 1, 2, 3, 4. These spawners are by default, they're set, they're deactivated by default. That's why they're grayed out. There are game managers, well, I'm calling them game managers, and there's 1 for each row. Each manager has a state machine attached to it. So the initial state, the variable is set to 4. Once the game starts and initializes, the next state has a action in which for every time a coin is destroyed, well, each coin is also linked to or assigned a global variable, and those global variables tell the game manager to subtract 1 point, or the number 1, from this total of 4. So when all 4 coins in a row are destroyed, the total number goes to 0, and this action is set up so that when the number equals 0, then it goes to the next state. There's a short wait period, and then it spawns the row. The reason that these are grayed out is because I am in the play mode. I'm just paused because the preview window is in the back. But in the spawn row state, the actions are to activate the game object. In this case, the game objects are the spawners in each row. So there should be 4 spawners, each one with its own action here. And you can see it says activate and then reset on exit. So when the spawners are finished, when they activate, they'll generate a coin, 1 each, which will drop down from the spawners into the row, and then when it goes on to the next state, when the state is finished, they'll reset and deactivate themselves. In addition to the spawners, there's also an action to activate game object for each of these gates. By default, they're on right now. They're not visible because I have the mesh renders turned off, but they are active. That's what's keeping these coins in their rows in these particular positions right now. So if you keep your eye on this hierarchy, you'll see row 2 activate briefly, these coin gates deactivate, and then when the state cycles, let me go to row 2 here. When the state finishes cycling, they'll go back to their default state. So let me go ahead and destroy these 2 coins left on row 2. Whoops. I'm actually looking at the preview in 3D and it's throwing me off. So okay, so row 2 just activated. I'm going to go ahead and just keep doing this to illustrate how this works. You can see row 3 activate and deactivate. The coin gates briefly deactivate. So it's kind of like a dance here between the coin gates deactivating and the spawners activating. And in this preview mode, I'd like to I need to adjust this. I'd like you to see the spawners as they activate. They're empty game objects with colored labels attached, so those appear. There they go. So they appear and disappear. So this is the system I have set up. And what I'd like to do next is to add a new coin into this system so that the new coin is assigned a variable. There's actually four different objects that would hold the same coin image, because in order for this system to work, the state machine has to know which row each coin is assigned to, so it can subtract the variable assigned to that coin from the initialized total. But I already have in my sprites folder Alexander Gold and Alexander Silver. I have in a prefabs folder, I have one coin for each emperor or empress, each character or personage, we could say. I have one for each row. If I bring one of these into the game area so that we can take a look at it, well, it's not just the image, but it's actually the image, which is it's inside of an empty game object. So I have an empty game object and I have the sprite image placed within that as a child of the empty game object. The reason for that is because there's a state machine attached to these coin objects, and they tell the object to destroy itself when the projectile collides. So there's an idle state. The projectile collides. It goes over to the next state, and what it's doing is it's generating an explosion, a sound of an explosion. It's creating a sprite that simulates an explosion, like an image of an explosion happening. It's an animation. and then it is deactivating the coin image, and then there's a wait time. The reason why this isn't applied only to the coin image itself is that the sound and the explosion animation need time in order for them to complete playing. If I was to attach this just to the just to the sprite itself, well, as soon as the projectile hits the sprite disappears and the explosion and the sound is generated. But if the sprite destroyed itself instantly, as it actually appears to do, when the game object destroys itself, it no longer exists. So this state machine disappears or destroys as well, and the sound cannot finish playing, and the explosion animation cannot finish playing. So the way around that is to embed or make the image a child of this empty game object, attach the state machine to the empty game object, and then direct the state machine to destroy the image instantly, and then wait long enough for the explosion and the explosion sound and images to finish playing before it destroys itself. So the illusion is that even though the state machine exists for nearly half a second after the projectile hits it, the coin disappears instantly. And this is really the only way to do it. So it makes it a little bit more complex than just bringing in the sprites and attaching the state machine, and when the projectile hits it, it explodes. So this is how it's set up, and if we take a look at this coin of Caracalla, we have on the sprite image itself, it just has the sprite renderer which shows the coin. On the empty game object, we've got a collider. We have a circle collider, and that's indicated by this green outline here. The collider is what allows the projectile to trigger the or activate the state machine that generates the explosion, makes the coin disappear, and all that stuff. We also have to have the rigid body attached. It's in a frozen position X and Z, so that as these coins drop down, they're affected by gravity and they have physics, and so when the coins drop down, I don't want them to spin or to move or roll around or anything like that. They stay vertically in the y-axis. They can move and are affected by gravity, but in X and Z, I mean Z probably doesn't matter for it probably wouldn't matter if I have this checked in 2D, but certainly the X state, which is the horizontal state on the screen, that is something that we need to freeze so that these coins don't appear to rotate. So in order to create my new coin, my Alexander coin, what I'm doing is I'm going to use this particular game object as my template. So I already have these set up. I already have the Caracalla coin object. Again, I have one prefab of each different type of coin object. I have to have one for each row because I have a variable assigned to each row, and so that's how I'm going to do it. Now, I had to make a copy of the Caracalla coin prefab by bringing it up and making an instance of the object. You can't just duplicate a prefab. In order to create a new prefab or essentially duplicate it, you've got to I'll do it again. You've got to drag up an instance of that prefab into the hierarchy. So let's get started on turning this into a coin of Severus Alexander. first thing I'm going to go ahead and do is rename it. So I'll call this Alexander. Once I have it renamed, I'm going to go to the sprite object and the sprite renderer and choose my Alexander silver coin. We're going to do the silver. Here it is. And that popped in just at the right size. Now I've got my circle collider here, and because this is a different shaped coin, I need to do some adjustment on its positioning. So it looks like I need to move it up in the Y position, and I need to move it over to the right a little bit in the X position. And that should be about right. I mean, the only way to really know for sure if it looks right is to test it out in the gameplay, but it should be pretty close. There's some extra at the top. That should be okay. That shouldn't affect anything. What I'm really concerned about is where it hits at the base of the coin, because that's where it's going to appear to be level or at an equal level with the coins next to it. That's where it's going to hit that gate collider when it drops down from the spawner. So now that I have this all adjusted, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it 3 more times, because I need one of these coin objects for each row. So I'm naming these so that they are that they correspond to the row numbers. So I have to rename not only the empty game object, but the child of the empty game object as well. I mean, I probably don't have to rename the child of the empty game object, but I think it's a good practice so that we don't get confused. Next thing I need to do is to I need to create a tag. I need to add a tag, one for each row. So I'm just going to quickly copy and paste from a existing tag and just change the name. And then I need to, for each of these objects, I need to assign the appropriate tag. So that if this is Alexander coin object row 4, then I need to assign it the row 4 tag that corresponds to it. And I'll go ahead and do the same for the other ones. These are already assigned to a coins layer, which is what I want, so I don't need to change anything there, but I do need to give these their unique tags. Next thing I need to do is to assign an individual global variable to each one of these. So since I copied this from a coin of Caracalla prefab, it's got the previous variable in there. So I'm going to create some new variables here. Okay, so I'm creating a global variable for each one of these Alexander coins, one for each row. It's unfortunate that in Unity you have to keep reopening this window every time I want to create a new variable. You can't just hit add and then create a new one. You've got to, I mean, refresh doesn't do anything. If anybody knows a way to do this, kind of a shortcut, that'd be great, but it's really seems pretty inefficient here. You have to keep reopening the same window again and again every time I need to create a variable. Alright, so I've got my 4 Alexander coin global variables. They're each set as a float type. I can go back to my object here, my coin object, and in the in Playmaker I've got a global variable state. I'm setting the float value at 1, so each coin has a float value of 1. I'm going to find my Alexander row 1 variable, and now I'm going to do the same thing for the other 3 coins. So setting the global variable for each coin with a float value of 1 and corresponding to their rows. Okay. Each one of these has another state machine attached to them. The projectile collision, and I don't need to make any changes here because as I rename the game objects, it automatically renames the object. It finds the same object in the state. It just automatically renames it for me. So I don't have to make any changes with that. I think I'm ready to create prefabs out of these. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag each one onto the prefab folder. And then delete these game object sprites, or I mean instances. So now we're working with these objects as prefabs. Next thing I need to do is to go to these spawners. So again, I've got an empty game object, one for each row, and within each row I've got a spawner for each of the 4 coin positions, and by default they're set to the off position. I have a state machine set up that will randomize the object that it's spawning. So I do have all these. This is all the characters or personages, emperors and empresses within a particular dynasty. There's 14 characters here. Each one has their own particular coin image, and the initial state, which I'm calling SendRandom, has an action within it called SendRandom event. There's 14 events because there are 14 different types of coins corresponding to the different people, and I've got an event created that corresponds to the name of each of these people. And so let's find the Alexander event. The Alexander event is right here, and it goes to a state called SpawnAlexander. Well, right now I have a coin of a different emperor in there just as a placeholder so that this whole system will work and there's no absent spaces. I'm going to replace this placeholder coin or prefab with the correct corresponding Alexander coin. So this is we're in row 4. There's position 1, 2, 3, and 4. The positions don't matter in terms of this. I just need to make sure that in each one of these positions I have my prefab of Alexander coin row 4 as the game object that's being created. So I'm going to drag my prefab over to here, and now I'm going to do the same thing for each of these other spawners. So there's 16 in total. So it's kind of a lot of manual production work here. And there's 16 spawners in total. and each of these needs to be assigned to the correct coin to spawn. Whoops. I want to make sure I need to, okay, so now I'm on row 3, so this is why it's easy to make an error here. I am now on row 3, and I need to make sure that I'm selecting the coin that corresponds with row 3, and I was on automatic pilot, and I just kept putting row 4 in there. So let me grab row 3. Okay, now I'm on row 2. So I need to make sure that I select the coin object that corresponds with row 2. Let me go back and double check. Okay, good. Now row 1. Okay, so when I preview the game again, coins of SpawnAlexander should be spawned randomly. It's set up to spawn these coins in each one of the appropriate spawners. Next thing I need to do is to go to my projectile prefab, and I need to add a new state machine that corresponds with this particular Alexander coin. So what I have is a trigger event set up, one for each position of the coin for each row, and then when the projectile hits that coin, it will subtract 1 from the row 1 global variable, and again when 4 units are subtracted from the variable, then it will generate new coins. They'll drop down from the spawners. It'll activate the spawners, deactivate the gates. So I have these. I could probably make a massive state machine with all of these, but I think it's a lot easier to have one for each. So what I've got in here already are the state machines corresponding to the coins I already have set up. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this one, add a new one, paste. And then well, let's rename it. And I could keep these same transition events. It really doesn't matter, but for the sake of organization and being able to go back and understand how this is all constructed, I'm going to make new events. So I'm going to make my unique event here for Alexander coins. And then just replace the current transition events with the new ones. So now I need to go back and select the proper tag. So I've got a tag, one for each row of the Alexander coin, and I've got a event that corresponds with it. Okay, so this will allow the projectile, the arrow in this case, to subtract from the float value of the row and allow this whole system to continue working. If I hadn't set this up, it wouldn't work right. It would, when the projectile hit the Alexander coin, it would not register, it would not subtract from the total float, and the rows would not, the spawners would not activate, and the rows would not drop down. So let me do a little test here and try it out and see if it's working. Do a little preview. Okay, so we do have a Alexander coin that spawned. Again, it's random, so in this entire game area of 16 coins, I only got one, but let's go ahead and see what happens when I preview this. Now, if I have the Alexander coin set up properly, when I hit that with the projectile, it should drop down. If I have it set up improperly, if I miss something, if I didn't label something correctly or whatever, it will not work. So let's give it a try. And it does work. And really the only way to be sure that it's completely working is to test it on all 4 rows. And because of the randomness of this, it's really impossible to do in a predictable way. So we'll just leave it at that, and that is how it should work, assuming that all of the coins in all of the rows were set up with the proper tags, with the proper variables, and the state machines are all modified accordingly. Thank you for watching.